Edgar Allan Poe asks, what fresh horrors await for us in the Norwegian seas? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about an author that I've encountered before. Quite a few of this person's books and short stories on this channel. And today's short story is all about rough seas and shipwrecks. I am referring to A Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar Allan Poe, which was published in 1845. For those who don't know, I've talked about Edgar Allan Poe on this channel before, so I don't need to go into that great of detail. But for those who don't know, Edgar Allan Poe was an American writer, white American writer who wrote in the 1800s. He wrote a number of short stories, The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, among many others that I've cataloged here on this channel. And I think he wrote just one fictional book, which is the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, another book that I've talked about on this channel. And he was also in mixed success in his time, and he was more appreciated after his death, as he lived a very depression-filled life because of the deaths he experienced, but also because of his lack of success. So a pretty interesting author, and I'm very happy to talk about maybe one of his lesser-known short stories on this channel. Because a lot of people know, Telltale Heart and the others, but they might not know about these lesser ones. I'll put a link to it in the description, so let me know your thoughts in the comments below about it. Without further ado, let's talk about Descent into the Maelstrom. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So A Descent into the Maelstrom focuses on an unnamed narrator who goes up a mountain in Norway with a guide. When he gets to the top, he sees the choppy seas and stormy kind of whirlpools that are going on the fjord-like islands that are nearby. And the guide tells him that he brought him up to this mountain to tell him a story about something that he experienced relating to the seas. And then the guide goes into a story where he talks about a fishing trip that he went on with his brothers. They had a smack, which is a type of boat that they used to get fish, and they were able to make more money than most. So it was a decent business for them. However, on one such occasion, they were sailing across the Norwegian seas when they encountered a bunch of storms that made things more challenging for them. It pushed them into the area where there was normally a maelstrom, and at least one brother was thrown off the boat in this storm and died, which is quite sad. But as they're tossed into the maelstrom, a bunch of whirlpools begin to form, and they begin finding themselves circling the drain to where most boats end up before they're inevitably pushed back to the top in complete ruins. One of the brothers, or the remaining brother, goes mad, and they both try to cling to like a post on the boat. And the guide realizes that it'd be fruitless because they're both going to the bottom of the ocean anyway, so it doesn't matter how it happens. And the boat continues to go into the whirlpool at this point. However, the guide then starts talking about how he used Archimedes' logic to realize that some things might float easier than others and not be so easy to go down to the bottom of the ocean in the whirlpool, and he realizes that thing would be a barrel. So he tosses it overboard and clings onto it, and the ship proceeds to go down while the barrel is kind of floating around for an hour before it floats back up to the top, and it drifts out into a nearby channel where there are other boats that eventually pick up the guide. Everyone around the guide notes that he's changed, especially physically, as his hair is now white. And the guide tries to tell the people what happened, but they don't believe him. And as the story comes to a close, the guide insists that this is true, but he also notes that the narrator probably won't believe him as well. In terms of analysis, there's a little bit worth talking about with a descent into the Maelstrom. One of the big themes, the central theme of this story, is that of man versus nature. One of the classic types of stories that you can tell. Edgar Allan Poe is doing that here. Poe writes a story that pits man against the elements. You can see this with the dangerous Norwegian whirlpools and just the stormy seas in general that are pushing the characters into the whirlpools. It's not very safe. It's a giant hazard. The guide says that he kind of expected it, but he didn't expect this horror to happen as they were drifting into the whirlpool and falling down into the below the surface to where they were presumably going to die. It drives them mad, and they're not having a good time. But it also seems to be dangerous on land as well. As they're climbing up the mountain, the narrator is quite worried because it just looks so dangerous. There's a bunch of cliffs, and the narrator has to cling to the ground because there's a strong wind as well. And the narrator notes, I didn't believe that the base of the mountain would be unsafe in this wind, but you can't know for sure. Which is just interesting how everything seems to be inhospitable for the humans in this story. And there's a good quote that gets further at this inhospitability. Allow me to read it to you. A panorama more deplorably desolate no human imagination can conceive. To the right and left, as far as the eye could reach, there lay outstretched like ramparts of the world, lines of horridly black and beetling cliff, whose character of gloom was but the more forcibly illustrated by the surf, which reared high up against its white and ghastly crest, howling and shrieking forever. And that's a really interesting quote, kind of giving this landscape a human feel to it, in that it's howling and shrieking. Very, very terrifying experience to see, but now imagine if you were sailing on it. And I think the question that Edgar Allan Poe is asking here is man king? Is man dominant on this landscape? We consider ourselves, the top of the food chain, nothing can touch us, but these elements, these terrifying seas and even these mountains can sometimes harm us and make it so that we're not as dominant as we think we are. And we like to think that we have the boats and the technology that is greater than that of 1845. But ship accidents, airplane accidents, a bunch of things still happen to us because of dangerous elements. Still happen to humanity because of dangerous elements. So are we truly king? Are we truly the top? Or are we just subject to whatever the earth throws at us and even the universe throws at us? Another element of the story is that of the unreliable narrator. Poe puts some doubts on the narrator's story and the guide's story as well. You see that with the fact that no one believes the guide when they pick them up via the boat, and they don't expect the narrator to believe them as well. So if they don't expect that, did this actually happen? That remains to be seen. But an important element of this is that it is a sea story. Like, you typically have these sea captains embellishing these sea stories that they tell other people as a form of entertainment. Is it possible that this sea captain is making up a story in order to entertain this traveler who's come into his land for a little bit? That's very well possible. And so it puts some doubt on everything that happens into the story, and is just an amusement, maybe more so than anything else. It's also interesting that Poe uses a framing device. He frequently uses framing devices as he has these characters introduce themselves and then talk about a terrifying experience that happened to them. And that happens here because the guide tells the narrator about his experience. But the guide also says that this is something that very few people survived, and yet the guide survived it. So is it a case of someone embellishing a story, maybe something that didn't happen to them, they made up, or did this actually happen? I feel like this would be easier to get away with in the 1840s when there wasn't the internet and TV and all that kind of stuff. And you could just make things up. Given you can still make things up today, but there's there's more opportunities for people to prove you wrong. And I just think that's interesting. So Poe is using an unreliable narrator here as a way to put some doubts on the story. Anyway, those are my thoughts on A Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar Allan Poe. A pretty interesting short story. Maybe not one of Poe's best, but still an interesting one from one of the short stories that doesn't get talked about as much as the other ones, like A Pit and a Pendulum, A Telltale Heart, but you have A Descent into the Maelstrom. And it's very clear that Poe really liked talking about the sea because in addition to those, horror stories that he talks about, and this is also horror, but like in addition to those traditional horror stories, he talks a lot about sailing and whatnot. And I don't believe he actually worked on a boat. He might have, he might not have, but he certainly had a fascination that led to him talking about it, writing about it, and trying to mythologize maybe a little bit of what's happening on the sea. So yeah, pretty interesting short story. Again, I'll put a link to it in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would love to have a discussion with you there. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author if they don't already know, or this short story. Also join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about books, movies, TV, that kind of stuff. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sea traveling travels. Farewell.